Yesterday evening, the BBC broadcast a Panorama documentary on the Lucy Letby case. Now, I should be clear that when I use the word documentary, I use it in the loosest term imaginable. It was originally my intention to respond to this documentary in some depth today, but considering that it was rubbish, I'm not going to be doing that. I will pick up on some of the points that were raised in future videos, as there are a few things that need to be cleared up. One thing I will say is that my favourite aspect of the programme was the impromptu conversations between Jonathan and Judith in wicker chairs. We can all be grateful that these spontaneous and insightful discussions haven't gone to waste, because thankfully they coincidentally had a camera crew record them. What I would like to say with regard to Panorama is that they did just miss out on one or two important points that they could have covered. Of course, at this point, Judith Moritz in particular is engaged in a massive arse-covering exercise, having been completely taken in hook, line and sinker by the prosecution case and very clearly placed herself in the guilty camp. She now has to somehow contort her way out of this position without looking completely ridiculous, which is proving rather difficult. Nonetheless, in this video I'm going to be looking at 200 problems with the prosecution case that weren't covered by this Panorama documentary. Now, it seems to me fairly incredible that in what was supposed to be a balanced piece of journalism, they failed to point out so many issues with the original prosecution case and issues around the evidence used in court. I should also point out that they didn't say a single thing to support any of the prosecution cases, particularly the by now completely discredited injection of air cases. But I'm certainly not going to neglect to point out all the problems with the prosecution case. So in this video, I'm going to be examining 200 problems that Panorama didn't tell you about. Part 1. Fundamental problems. 1. No one has ever seen Lucy Letby do anything wrong. This is uncontested and agreed by both the defence and prosecution. The prosecution case is entirely hypothetical. It is therefore hugely reliant on the quality of evidence provided, given that there is no smoking gun pointing to guilt. 2. 17 nurses provided statements to the Thirlwell inquiry. These statements were finally published in February 2025 after the culmination of the public inquiry. None of the nurses had any suspicions or concerns about Lucy Letby, nor criticism regarding her practice. Several explicitly consider Lucy to be innocent. It is important to note that these are the people who work closest with Lucy Letby and know her best. 3. There is no psychological consistency with a serial killer in Lucy Letby herself. There are no criminogenic factors. There is no indication of any breakdown in normal behaviour. She is socialised. She is popular. The police were unable to locate any dirt on her whatsoever. Lucy is almost implausibly squeaky clean and gave no indication of any form of aberrant or errant behaviour or psychological indication at the time of these supposed crimes. 4. In common with this, Lucy Letby never referenced any murders anywhere. She never wrote about it. She never searched for anything related to murder. There is no indication of any macabre interest or behaviour, quite the opposite. 5. There is no plausible motive for the supposed crimes of Lucy Letby, and no one has really even attempted to suggest one. The prosecution made some rather feeble attempts to reference a supposed affair with a doctor, but couldn't present any concrete evidence for this, not even one mildly flirtatious text message. Part 2. Statistics problems. 6. The shift chart that was a key item of evidence for the prosecution is riddled with problems. Several statisticians have told me that the chart cannot in fact be produced by working forwards. Professor Jane Hutton recently commented that the chart is so crude that it can only be described as grossly misleading. 7. Speaking of Professor Jane Hutton, her statistical analysis of the Lucy Letby case, which had been commissioned by Cheshire Police, was cancelled due to orders from the Crown Prosecution Service. It should be noted that the Crown Prosecution Service has never responded to questions regarding why they did this. Had Professor Hutton been involved with police, it is highly likely that the case would never have gone to court, and it certainly wouldn't have gone to court in its current form. It's also notable that this was never disclosed to Lucy Letby's defence team. 8. The recent ITV documentary on Lucy Letby was one of many sources which points out that the definition of suspicious events used in compiling this shift chart is far from clear. This hugely affects the way that it was constructed, leading to assertions from credentialed experts that it was essentially reverse engineered. 9. Lucy Letby was demonstrably not on duty for several collapses during the court case. For several other collapses in the case, it was unfeasible that Lucy Letby could have carried out any malignant behaviour without detection, as she was accompanied by other nurses. 10. There is literally no evidence in many cases that Lucy was even in the room when collapses occurred. 11. No context was ever given to the court or jury regarding spikes in big data being inevitable. This is something that has been cited by many statisticians that I've spoken with. 12. Child F was included in the original shift chart, which is an immediate problem with the chart. This is presumably included because the prosecution alleges that Lucy Letby carried out some of the hypothetical acts related to Child F on the 4th of August, although they have no evidence for this. The collapse of Child F that is cited as being critical is on the 5th of August, when it is agreed by everyone that Lucy Letby is not on shift. This immediately renders the shift chart inaccurate and erroneous. 13. Numerous assertions in the court case are entirely reliant on the shift chart being accurate. 14. The prosecution indeed relied on the assertion that Lucy was always on duty throughout the court case, citing it in regard to Child A and Child B, Child C, Child D, Child E, Child G, Child H, Child K, Child L and Child M, Child N, Child O, Child P, and Child Q. In fact, the only instance for which I haven't found specific reference to this in court is Child J, for which Lucy Letby was found not guilty, and Child F, which shouldn't have been on the shift chart in the first place. Part 3. Specific medical problems. 15. The prosecution case significantly misrepresented the state of numerous infants involved in the court case. One example of this is Child G, with this infant suffering from decreased lung capacity and chronic lung disease, hyaline membrane disease, bilateral pulmonary interstitial emphysema, a serious lung condition, hypoglycemia, gastroesophageal reflux, which refers to stomach acid flowing into the esophagus, thrombocytopenia, low blood platelet count, and blood gases indicating signs of sepsis. Dr. Xu Li described Child G as an infant with a lot of chronic problems. 16. Numerous infants showed signs of infection, and this was all discounted by lead prosecution witness Dr. Dewi Evans. 17. Literally the majority of infants in the trial were suffering with sepsis. This was also discounted by Dr. Evans. Count of Chester patient Ollie Stopforth tragically died in circumstances related to sepsis, and this was not recognised at the hospital. 18. The deadly bacteria Pseudomonas aeruginosa was present on the neonatal unit. There is an intrinsic relationship between Pseudomonas and sepsis, which is well established. 19. Another pathogen, Stenotrophomonas multifilia, was also detected on the unit. Contrary to claims that have been made, this was not ruled out by testing, as will be discussed later in this video. 20. The claims of Dr. Dewi Evans with regard to Child G, that the infant was overfed with milk, are entirely laughable and not even taken seriously by anyone. 21. Child E was very clearly suffering with a massive gastrointestinal bleed, and the science used in court in relation to this child can reasonably be described as spurious and without any merit whatsoever. 22. The vulnerability of twins and triplets was never adequately explained during the court case, despite the fact that there were several twins and triplets among the infants that experienced problems on the unit. 23. In the prosecution case, Barrister Nick Johnson made several extraordinary assertions regarding Lucy Letby systematically attacking twins and triplets, attempting to somehow tie them together, whereas these vulnerabilities of twins and triplets were never properly discussed. 24. The downgrading of the unit, which continues to the present day at the Countess of Chester, even though neonatal operations have been moved to a newly purposed unit, was never properly contextualised in court. In fact, Dr. Stephen Breary commented that practices were going from good to better, the fact that we were working on a very good unit that normally had very good results, this all became exceptional. 25. Legal representative Corinne Slingo had told numerous key personnel from the Countess of Chester in July 2016 that there is a likelihood that, having changed the admissions criteria to remove the highest risk of sub-32-week neonates, that the mortality rate will drop significantly in any event, and that could easily be interpreted as being due to the removal of the individual as the timescales coincide. That may make life much more difficult for her and also for the Trust in trying to identify the true cause of the spike in mortality for this group of babies. The subsequent fall in mortality was therefore not only predictable but actually predicted. The court, of course, never heard this. 26. Numerous odd claims were made regarding resuscitation, including the assertion that this is somehow straightforward. This is too complex to discuss at length in this video, but one study found that while most neonates survive basic bagging ventilation, over 1% die, and this rises to 50% when advanced resuscitation is required. 27. Dr. Dewi Evans later informed Raj Persaud that getting a baby to start breathing again is quite straightforward, and that babies died in Chester despite what I considered outstanding efforts to resuscitate them. Conversely, Professor Colin Morley commented that the resuscitation of child C was just one example of suboptimal practice on the unit. Morley continued, the skills on the unit were not up to the job of resuscitating a tiny baby like this, and that's not surprising. This sounds very critical, but this was a hospital that wasn't really set up for a baby as small and sick as this. They were just out of their depth. 28. Claims were made in court and later repeated by police that neonatal collapses are always expected. This is a stupendously ridiculous assertion. 29. However, it can be argued that the collapse of some of these infants was indeed expected due to a combination of clinical signs, inattention, and poor treatment. The issue is that Dr. Dewi Evans in particular failed to communicate these factors to the court. 30. Dr. Dewi Evans commented in court that most concerning was that the infants failed to respond to resuscitation. But in fact, there are very good reasons for this. Dr. Evans either failed to notice or understand them, refused to cite them for some reason, or both. 31. In accordance with this, when writing to Dr. Jane Horden, a pathologist, Medical Director Ian Harvey observed that noting a failure to respond to resuscitation is always going to be very subjective. 32. There were multiple failures across several infants with breathing support and intubations. One of these was even cited by Dr. Jane Horden during her appearance at the Thirlwell inquiry. 33. The case of Child D is emblematic of the entire court case. Lucy Letby is serving a life sentence for the murder of Child D, despite not being present for the initial collapses, not being the designated nurse, not having been witness doing anything untoward or suspicious, and the fact that the prosecution case was entirely hypothetical. And it is agreed by all parties contradicting the prosecution case that the medical evidence used in court is highly dubious and that other more prosaic and obvious explanations for the tragic passing of Child D, such as infection, were bizarrely completely ignored. 34. A very obvious bowel obstruction was ignored in the case of Child C. Child E and Child J were among other infants who suffered with undiagnosed bowel issues, which also went largely undiscussed in the court case and which were overlooked by Dr. Dewi Evans. 35. Incorrect evidence was given by Professor Sally Kinsey with regard to Child A and Child B. Kinsey made erroneous statements regarding antiphospholipid syndrome in court, which contradicts clear guidance from the British Society for Haematology. 36. There were no genetic studies done for any of the infants in the case, yet thousands of potential genetic conditions could have contributed to health outcomes on the unit. 37. Child A couldn't have her long line pulled back because qualified staff were busy with another child. Neonatal nurse practitioner Sloane Spade described this to me as a very serious issue, citing prolonged dehydration paired with risk of overheating under a heat lamp while attempting to place a long line multiple times. 38. Very clear signs of the serious intestinal disease, necrotizing enterocolitis, were discounted in numerous infants in the case. 39. In the case of child J, Dr. Stephen Breary told the Thirlwell Inquiry in a written statement that electrolyte disturbance might have caused a seizure. Other possible causes included sepsis or a collection of pus in the bowel. In court, Breary had commented that I do know hypoxia causes seizures, so that would be possibly the most likely cause. There remains the question of why child J was hypoxic when 2 or 3 weeks beforehand she had been breathing normally in air and there was no suggestion of infection. It is not entirely clear how his opinion changed so much in the intervening period. 40. A subcapsular hematoma cited by 2 pathologists in the case of child O and also the panel was bizarrely overturned in court by Dr. Dewi Evans. 41. Dr. Andreas Marnarides made a bold assertion about injuries suffered by child O being akin to those that one would suffer in a road traffic accident. It is notable that Marnarides conceded to relying on the notes and reports of Dr. Dewi Evans. This assertion has since been criticised by other pathologists, including one who told the BBC that unless a witness saw non-accidental injury occur, then you simply can't say this. To say that it is beyond reasonable doubt, and this was something that was not natural, that this is a non-accidental injury, to put it bluntly, it's naive. I have seen this sort of injury, but the prosecution expert must never have seen it. Part 4. Evans and Bohin problems. 42. Dr. Dewi Evans changed his opinion and introduced entirely new diagnoses into the case during the trial, perhaps most extraordinarily in the case of child C. This infant was chronically unwell and there were obvious blunders with treatment, which makes the so-called medical opinion of Dr. Evans on this case, frankly, quite laughable. 43. But then Dr. Dewi Evans changed his opinion again after the trial, abandoning the opinion on child C that he'd introduced during the court case. Many suspect this is because the splinting of the diaphragm theory had been widely ridiculed by neonatologists. It should be noted that Dr. Evans wrote to Channel 5 indicating this in what can reasonably be described as a highly patronising letter. 44. The Court of Appeal verdict is now contradicted by these changed theories, although this hasn't prevented Dr. Evans from explicitly praising the Court of Appeal more than once, even after he wrote to Channel 5. 45. Dr. Evans also shifted around incidents during the trial after he had filed his final reports, ostensibly because Lucy Letby was not on duty when the original collapse was cited. 46. The peer review process conducted by Dr. Sandy Bohin involved Dr. Dewi Evans passing his conclusions reports to Dr. Bohin, a really obviously prejudicing factor that essentially renders the whole process worthless. Coincidentally, Dr. Bohin agreed with absolutely everything that Dr. Evans said. By no reasonable standard is this a competent peer review. 47. The so-called peer review also did not include the aforementioned cases that were changed during and after the court case by Dr. Evans. These were never peer reviewed. 48. In fact, nothing in this case was blind. Dr. Evans walked into a police station in Cheshire and immediately claimed that he was certain that inflicted harm had taken place. This somewhat contrasts with the views of 26 world-class experts who spent months diligently poring over case notes and never found any evidence of inflicted harm. 49. At various points, Dr. Evans has claimed to have used a differential diagnosis and a diagnosis of exclusion, but the methodology involved in the efforts of Dr. Evans comes nowhere near meeting this claim, not least because he only ever considered methods of murder. In fact, his methodology is so specious that there are no diagnoses in the Letby court case, merely theories and hypotheses. In this video, when I describe the work of Dr. Evans' diagnoses, I am being unduly generous. 50. Dr. Evans randomly made reference to a noxious substance in court, despite the fact that this had nothing to do with the allegations and he had already ruled this out of the court case. 51. Dr. Evans had initially concluded that child C was at great risk of unexpected collapse, although it's not entirely clear how an infant can be at great risk of collapse, but the collapse is also unexpected. He then turned this around in later reports, changed his opinion in court, and completely removed one incident from the case of child C. 52. In the case of child C, a critical X-ray was taken at least 1 day before the infant child C died, and prior to Lucy Letby having had any contact with the baby, but was still cited as evidence in the court case. 53. Dr. Evans has made several claims that he wasn't aware of Lucy Letby's name. The first thing that can be said about this is that Evans knew Lucy's name from 2018 at the latest because she was arrested at this time, and the Cheshire Constabulary cynically ensured that her name was all over the papers by digging up her garden and leaking this to the press. Dr. Evans made countless amendments and submitted numerous reports after learning of Lucy Letby's name. Coincidentally, he then shifted cases, incidents and collapses all over the place, but always concluded that Lucy Letby was guilty. 54. Furthermore, Lucy's name was all over documents that Dr. Evans saw in 2017, and by this time Dr. Stephen Breary and Dr. Ravi Jairam had made it crystal clear to police in a meeting held on the 15th of May 2017 that they suspected a nurse, and even made it very easy for the police to identify that this nurse was Lucy Letby. 55. The cross-examination of Dr. Evans was a train wreck. There is not much that I can possibly add to that. 56. In the case of child E, Dr. Evans originally suggested that Lucy Letby had thrust a nasogastric tube down the throat of this infant. He later changed the object when he realised there was no nasogastric tube available. 57. Dr. Sandy Bohin cited the importance of a noise that she never heard directly based on a statement from parents that she never corroborated in what can only be described as a fairly extraordinary piece of testimony. Bohin still cited this as being central to the collapse of child N. Part 5. Injection of air problems. 58. Dr. Dewi Evans used a 1989 paper authored by Lee and Tanswell as the sole diagnostic source for his air injection theory. Dr. Evans has made specious claims regarding having used 18 papers in court, but this was contradicted both by Dr. Evans himself in court and the Court of Appeal verdict, which Dr. Evans has praised more than once. It must have escaped his attention that the Court of Appeal contradicted his claims, and also the fact that the Court of Appeal contradicted his letter to Channel 5. 59. Dr. Shu Lee, co-author of the Lee and Tanswell paper, has singularly rejected the theories of Dr. Evans, the way that his paper was used in the court case, and has since headed a panel which has similarly rejected the hypothesis that there were any murders on this unit. It is important to emphasise that this theory was central to the entire court case, and that Dr. Shu Lee is also one of the most highly regarded neonatologists in Canada. Conversely, Dr. Evans never even qualified to be a neonatologist and hasn't set foot in a hospital for nearly 20 years. In fact, at this point, no one really takes the theories of Dr. Evans even remotely seriously, which is important as they were central to the entire prosecution case. 60. The logistics regarding air injection are highly doubtful, according to numerous doctors and nurses. 61. The potential accidental presence of air was never accounted for by Dr. Evans. 62. Indeed, all of the papers that Dr. Evans cited were related to the accidental presence of air. 63. During court proceedings, Professor Owen Arthurs gave evidence regarding a study which indicated that air is inadvertently present in approximately 40% of infants, always accidentally. 64. According to his own words, Dr. Evans diagnosed air embolism based on the sudden collapse of infants and the failure to respond to resuscitation. There is no known universe in which this is a valid diagnosis. This means that Dr. Evans diagnosed air embolism before having any meaningful diagnostic criteria, because those cited would be consistent with literally hundreds of conditions. This statement alone essentially completely invalidates everything that Dr. Evans presented with regard to this so-called diagnosis. 65. There are no published papers related to the mechanism of air embolism alleged in court, and both Dr. Evans and Dr. Bohin conceded they had never encountered it before. 66. The literature cited in court was incredibly weak, related to deep-sea divers and animals. Even Professor Sally Kinsey conceded this in court. This should have been a critical point, as the whole injection of air theory is entirely reliant on literature, but the jury may not have understood this. 67. Dr. Evans invented the highly precise and technical term a dollop of air during the court case. 68. Evidence presented regarding rashes was categorically incorrect, passed from one case to another, even though the rashes were notably different. 69. The evidence related to discoloration in the court case was wrong and has been refuted by Dr. Lee. 70. The Lee and Tanswell paper did not describe the features of air embolism described in court. Indeed, the Lee and Tanswell paper addresses pulmonary vascular air embolism, not venous air embolism, and this was mentioned during a press conference to announce the findings of the international panel on the 4th of February 2025. 71. The mottling and skin discoloration that was cited as being important in court is associated with numerous other conditions. Indeed, one doctor told me that anybody who is undergoing a circulatory collapse will become mottled, and that mottling can take a range of appearances. Pathologist Dr. Jane Horden told the Thirlwell inquiry that I was surprised that Ian Harvey asked about mottling because it is such a common finding in babies that are unwell, and we were sadly talking about babies who were unwell. Air embolism is something that would not have crossed my mind at all at that stage when thinking about mottling. I would be thinking of common causes of mottling in the skin. 72. Discoloration seen in air embolism is very fleeting, which does not fit the timeline required in multiple infants during the court case. 73. The paper by Lee and Tanswell also references an earlier study, Post-mortem gas accumulation in premature infants, published in 1974. What this study demonstrates is that if X-rays of a baby are not taken within 25 minutes of death, the build-up of air or gas in the body is completely irrelevant because it's nothing to do with the situation when the baby died. The study indeed concludes that since physiologic gas accumulation can occur rapidly, the significance of post-mortem intravascular gas can be interpreted only if the interval between death and the radiographic exposure is known. 74. Dr. Evans never accounted for hyaline membranes, which were referenced by the panel of international experts with regard to child B. 75. Multiple neonatologists have since spoken publicly of their borderline contempt for the theories of Dr. Evans. Part 6. Insulin problems. 76. Inadequate insulin testing was done from the very start because immunoassays are prone to numerous inaccuracies and cross-contaminations. An immunoassay is simply a screening test similar to a COVID test. There is no way that one immunoassay test should be used as the sole basis for deciding whether someone receives a life sentence. 77. The United Kingdom and Ireland Association of Forensic Toxicologists define immunoassay as a screening method and clearly state that it needs to be followed up. This is quite evident from the laboratory guidelines of the organisation, which state that presumptive screening tests such as immunoassay must be appropriate and validated for the type of biological specimens being analysed. With regards to immunoassay used on whole blood, they must be appropriately validated for that purpose, especially if using post-mortem blood. 78. Immunoassay does not directly measure insulin. It uses antibodies to bind to a substance that normally would bind insulin with high affinity, but can also bind other substances, and this is the same for C-peptide. If you really suspect factitious insulinemia, you must do the right test. And the correct test is a test that tells you the difference between synthetic insulin and endogenous insulin. This is necessary in clinical settings, but if you're going to convict someone in court, then you must do mass spectrometry. This is the only assay that will distinguish exogenous insulin from endogenous insulin because some of the analogues only differ by a single amino acid. It's very easy to get false results, not just because the test can give false positive results, but also because there are errors, heterogenic errors, pharmaceutical errors, the wrong bag being delivered to the wrong baby, and many others. 79. It is an essential requirement, according to published standards, to undertake confirmatory testing of the immunoassay result using a different, more specific methodology. One which was previously method is liquid chromatography mass spectrometry. 80. The insulin readings at a laboratory that tested immunoassays varied by nearly 800%. There have been claims that this was due to a manual transcription, not a measuring error, but there are several problems with this. Firstly, there are still undeniably measuring errors with immunoassays. That is undeniable. Secondly, there are still problems with cross-contamination. Thirdly, errors can occur with labelling, manual transcription, etc. in any case. Indeed, that has been cited by experts that I've spoken with. Fourthly, this doesn't get away from the fact that the immunoassay is not a forensic or laboratory test. It's a cheap and dirty screening test. Proper testing for insulin was never conducted, and the bags were never retained, so the entire basis of the prosecution case remains both hypothetical and untested. Finally, it should also be mentioned that the laboratory test being inaccurate is absolutely nothing to do with the defence of Lucy Letby or any of the submissions that were made to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. 81. Both Child F and Child L, the two infants that Lucy Letby was convicted of poisoning, survived, hence there was no particular concern at the Cancer Chester at the time and no attempt to conduct critical follow-up testing. The lack of concern at the laboratory is quite tangible in documents made available by the Thirlwell Inquiry. 82. The prosecution case relies on feeding bags being spiked. There is no proof of this, it is purely hypothetical. The hospital could have retained the feeding bags, but did not. 83. Lucy was not on duty for instances when feeding bags were hung out and when the supposed poisonings therefore occurred. 84. Without going into this in great detail, Lucy Letby would have needed to guess which bags were going to be hung out. The odds are simply against this, and it doesn't make any sense as a method of murder. 85. Feeding bags were chosen from the stock cupboard, not the pharmacy. Again, it would simply be impossible to anticipate this. 86. There were further logistical issues in the prosecution case which required a sticky insulin theory to be invented in order to explain these issues away. This theory is contrived, inconsistent with measurements taken on the unit, and another highly dubious part of this overall logistically implausible hypothesis. 87. There are serious question marks regarding whether the method of poisoning and specifics related to it indicated in court were pharmacologically active. I was told this by a major insulin expert who emphasised that it is yet another aspect of the prosecution case that is unscientific, hypothetical, and not based on any tested or proven mechanism. 88. Lucy was told insulin poisoning had definitely occurred and asked to accept this during the court case. This was an underhand tactic that had then been used against her by the prosecution. Lucy is not qualified to comment on this matter. She knows this very well and had no choice other than to accept what she had been told. This was in no way a legitimate line of questioning or strategy from the prosecution and, in my opinion, was frankly disgraceful. 89. The jury heard very little regarding any doubts with insulin. They were in fact told that it was a definite poisoning and that all other cases would be dragged along by this assumption. 90. Dr. Evans told the court that there is only one explanation for what he described as astonishing blood readings. Child F had received insulin from some outside source. One might imagine that Dr. Evans actually knew what he was talking about, but he later told Dr. Philip Hammond of Private Eye that I didn't even know that there was more than one way of measuring insulin until I read the comments from Alan Wayne Jones. That obviously didn't prevent him from making a definitive statement in court. 91. Assertions regarding C-peptide made in court are now known to be demonstrably wrong. This is proven it's not even contentious, it is simply plain wrong for neonates. This was discussed in Panorama but not with any particular understanding. Biological evidence and stringent study from literally the world's leading experts in studying this that is now available indicates that the ranges asserted in court are simply plain wrong. 92. Child F was hypoglycemic with sepsis, which are far more relevant to the condition of the infant than some supposed hypothetical poisoning. 93. Blood sugar rising and falling as presented in the court case is consistent with naturally occurring hypoglycemia. 94. Errors were made with IV lines and the injection of boluses which impacted on the care and well-being of child F. 95. The court was misled by Dr. Anna Milan, who, among several inaccurate statements, asserted that the only way you can get a pattern like that is if insulin has been given to a patient, which is a frankly astonishing assertion. 96. Dr. Gwen Walk, for some reason best known to herself, contradicted her own academic published work with Professor Vincent Marks during the court case. The defence could literally have got her academic paper, read it out in front of her, and destroyed it as a witness, but failed to do so. 97. The requirement for cases to be sent to Guildford for issues related to exogenous insulin was known about at the time, but ignored. This was flagged up by the laboratory, who tested samples from the cancer chest at the time, and was also referenced by Sarah Davies at the Thirlwell inquiry, but it was never done. 98. Despite this, the court heard literally completely untrue testimony related to this. The aforementioned Dr. Anna Milan told the court that Guildford would have been deciding the type of exogenous insulin rather than whether exogenous insulin had been used, which is simply utterly incorrect. This was an unbelievable statement because the regulations and standard practice is widely available, yet the court was misinformed, literally given incorrect information. 99. Glucose levels on the infants were not measured at the time. 100. Research shows that the presence of antibodies, including insulin autoantibodies, can interfere with the immunoassay result and cause falsely high insulin results. This is a known problem with immunoassays. 101. There was a third insulin case with similar readings in which an infant was shown to be suffering with hyperinsulinism. The court never even heard about this infant. 102. In fact, this third case was hidden from the jury because it torpedoes the whole prosecution case. It was even rapidly removed from the Thirlwell inquiry website, but fortunately I have saved a copy on my computer. 103. It should also be mentioned that the third insulin case was yet another infant with sepsis. 104. At the time that child F and child L were present on the neonatal unit, glucose readings of 999 were made, which were almost certainly an error. This is just one indication that the testing and measuring of the baby's circumstances was erroneous. 105. From a practical perspective, Lucy was a terrible poisoner because if she had spiked these feeding bags with insulin, the antidote of glucose was already present, meaning that the poisoning would almost inevitably be unsuccessful, and indeed it was. This is basic chemistry that virtually anyone with any awareness or intelligence knows to be the case. 106. Why would Lucy Letby use insulin when she had already supposedly been successful with air? She then supposedly failed to kill child F, returned to using air again, and then attempted insulin again with child L, which failed again, and then moved on to other murder methods once more. This makes absolutely no sense. 107. The court case relies on going back several years and re-examining figures in a haphazard way when it is clear that there was no concern about poisoning at the time when both infants survived and when there is a pattern of naturally occurring insulin. To say this is unreliable would be an understatement. 108. Professor Matthew Yoll is just one person to point out that Olympic athletes and other sports people receive better testing and more protection than occurred in the court case. This seems extraordinary considering the consequences involved for the defendant relative to winning or not winning a medal. 109. The Forensic Science Regulator Code came into effect in 2023. This provides improved guidance for the use of forensic science in court cases. Unfortunately, this was too late to help Lucy Letby. Part 7. Countess of Chester Problems. 110. Countless medical errors were discounted and never mentioned in the court case, quite honestly more than can reasonably be discussed here. 111. Among these was a serious blunder by Dr. Stephen Breary when aspirating child O, in which he damaged the liver of the infant with a needle. It is clear that Breary engaged in the wrong medical procedure at the time. This is well documented, and indeed I have documented this in previous videos. Furthermore, he also aspirated blood at the time. This is not contested. Finally, claims regarding the pathologist are odd, as two pathologists cited a subcapsular hematoma as being critical in this case, and then that was completely discounted by Dr. Evans during the court process. 112. The problems with sewage on the unit were mentioned during the court case, but the consequences of this were never properly explained to the jury, in particular the link between sewage, sepsis and Pseudomonas. 113. Hospital staff repeatedly appeared as experts in the court case, but their testimony was misleading as they were singularly unaware of their own blunders and lack of knowledge. Staff from the Countess Chester Hospital appeared as witnesses in the court case. Many of these staff appeared to be unaware of mistakes that they'd made, and their lack of experience and understanding means that they were unable to provide meaningful diagnoses or indeed refutation with regard to some of the allegations made by the prosecution. 114. There was a constant pattern throughout the court case, and indeed events at the Countess of Chester, of testing being required for various reasons and none being carried out. 115. The court didn't hear about the failure of the Countess of Chester to meet the British Association of Perinatal Medicine standards for various aspects of operations on the unit. The hospital and its staff were well aware of this. 116. The court didn't hear about the Care Quality Commission criticism of the neonatal unit. 117. It was never explained to the court or jury that there was no neonatologist on the unit at the Countess of Chester, while its advanced neonatal nurse practitioner position was removed, and there were numerous other staffing issues. 118. In fact, prosecuting barrister Nick Johnson invested considerable time and effort in trying to reject the significance of any staffing issues with regard to the outcome of infants. This was a central argument of his closing speech. Those who have worked on neonatal units strongly disagree with this. 119. The court didn't hear about the inadequate number of ward rounds conducted at the Countess of Chester, which occurred twice weekly instead of the twice daily that is generally recommended. This has been roundly criticised by both doctors and nurses. 120. The court didn't hear about the instances of elevated stillbirths that occurred at the Countess of Chester at the same time as problems on the neonatal unit. 121. The repeated transferring of infants within the Northwest Neonatal Network was never properly contextualised in the court case. Some infants were transferred multiple times, even though this was clearly inappropriate. 122. The lack of skills and poor monitoring on the neonatal unit means that incidents can be missed or even not adequately understood. This means that the court received an entirely false impression of what occurred on the neonatal unit, as we now know from the international panel of experts. 123. Child C did not see a consultant until the third day of its life, despite being in a perilous state. This was symptomatic of blunders and inattentiveness on the unit. 124. Many infants being treated at the Countess of Chester were tiny and hugely premature. They were therefore particularly vulnerable, and the general medical consensus is that several of these infants should have been treated on a level 3 neonatal unit. Instead, they were born and treated on a level 2 unit that was downgraded to level 1 and still hasn't been returned to level 2 status. Even in the last few days, a report on the Countess of Chester has once again been damning, even with regard to their ability to deal with sepsis, which has now been dragging on for at least 10 years. 125. Insufficient testing was done on the unit. One obvious example of this is in relation to Stenotrophomonas multifilia. The statement from Thirlwell lawyers claims that this condition was ruled out by testing, but this claim is frankly utterly farcical. Ruling out Stenotrophomonas multifilia requires extremely specific testing, and this simply wasn't conducted. The assertion from lawyers is based on the testimony of Dr. Evans, but he also ruled out sepsis, which was literally endemic on the unit. 126. One of the many errors from the hospital was the failure to retain feeding bags in relation to the allegedly insulin poisoned child F and child L. A document from the Thirlwell inquiry indicates that they retained bags for another infant but chose not to do so for the insulin cases. 127. There were too many medical errors on the unit to discuss in this video, but one that must be mentioned is the failure to conduct a blood transfusion in the case of child E. This tiny neonate lost over 25% of its blood supply, and the failure to conduct a transfusion has been cited as critical in the infant's collapse and demise. Part 8. Circumstantial case problems. 128. The prosecution made numerous unfounded and unsupported assertions during the trial. One such example was when prosecutor Nick Johnson told the court that the truth is, ladies and gentlemen, that Lucy Letby had a fascination with the babies she had murdered and attempted to murder, and with their families. She took pleasure in her murderous handiwork. Far from being the truth, there is literally no evidence for this. 129. The court was also subjected to all manner of embarrassing cross-examination. One such example was when Nick Johnson asked Lucy Letby whether she disputed being born. 130. The case of child E requires Lucy to hang around for an hour doing nothing while a child bleeds to death. Having examined the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester in a previous video, this seems phenomenally unlikely to the point of being completely implausible. 131. Lucy raised alarms on numerous occasions in the court case in order to draw attention to infants that had collapsed or were suffering. A notable example of this is in the case of the aforementioned child E. Essentially, Lucy is often punished for being the most alert and conscientious person on the unit. 132. A telephone log used in the case of child E is likely incorrect, as the prosecution case related to these timings makes absolutely no sense. 133. The swipe card data from the court case were reversed for 9 infants, rendering it completely worthless almost immediately. 134. The prosecution contradicted its own swipe card data in court when Nick Johnson, the prosecuting barrister, conceded that it was possible for anyone to sneak in behind anyone else at any time without swiping, therefore rendering the entire dataset completely worthless. 135. If there weren't enough reasons to doubt the swipe card data already, a staircase from the nursery had no swipe card exit, meaning that all of the data used in court can give a completely misleading impression regarding the whereabouts of various people. The Crown Prosecution Service sees no problem with this, but then the Crown Prosecution Service recently wanted to have a retrial for the exonerated Justin Plummer. 136. Advanced neonatal nurse practitioner Michelle Warden also pointed out to me recently that parents could easily be present at numerous occasions during the court case when this is not noted because they don't have swipe cards and could have followed nurses or doctors into units and nurseries. 137. There are countless examples of Lucy Letby being accused of deliberately harming infants at times when she wasn't the designated nurse for a baby. Sometimes acts of caring and attention were held against her, and other times Lucy simply became guilty by virtue of being on duty. 138. Lucy Letby also wasn't present when child F was allegedly poisoned by her, but this infant still appears in the shift chart. 139. Numerous infant collapses were excluded from the court case, the jury simply never heard about them. 140. Many of the most rapid deteriorations occurred when Lucy Letby was not on duty. This has been confirmed by a shift chart compiled by the publication Unheard, which relied on a shift chart provided by Peter Elston by Dr. Dewi Evans himself. 141. Even when Lucy is present for collapses, there are several incidents where she is either explicitly not cot-side or carrying out any malicious acts is completely unthinkable due to the presence of other staff. This makes the idea that Lucy Letby has conducted malignant harm in these circumstances completely unthinkable. 142. Considering these various factors, the logistics of these attacks are implausible to the point of impossibility. The neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester was cramped and people were moving around on a regular basis. The level of risk required in one attack is quite significant, but the scale and scope of attacks alleged without detection or suspicion from anyone on the unit is frankly utterly ridiculous. 143. One example of this is the case for child P, in which the prosecution case involves 3 witnesses being present at the same time as Lucy supposedly attacking the baby. The prosecution also moved collapses around, causing Ben Myers to compare the prosecution case to a game of chess with check, check, check moving around. It's not the night before, okay, now it's the night before. 144. Several assertions related to the internal Datex record system were literally fabricated by the prosecution. All evidence points to Lucy being the most conscientious compiler of Datex information on the unit. 145. One assertion from the Court of Appeal is that Lucy appeared to be fixated with being involved in events in the intensive care nursery and involved herself unnecessarily with babies who had been designated to other nurses. One could rather describe this as a responsible attitude and natural degree of concern from someone who had been prematurely thrust into a position of seniority on the unit. Part 9. Court Process Problems. 146. Character witnesses who were willing to speak in favour of Lucy Letby were advised not to appear in court. 147. The judge from a previous case in which lead prosecution witness Dr. Dewi Evans appeared wrote to Letby trial judge James Goss stating that the evidence that Evans had provided in the previous case was worthless and that he had made no effort to give a balanced opinion. Objectively, Dewi Evans should have been thrown out of this court case immediately, as such an intervention by a judge is pretty much unprecedented. However, for some unknown reason, he was allowed to continue in the court case. 148. There was an extraordinary exchange between Lucy Letby and prosecuting barrister Nick Johnson, in which the latter became fixated on whether or not Lucy Letby owned a shredder. This was symptomatic of the quality of evidence presented in the court case. 149. Another example of this came when Johnson attempted to make capital from whether or not Lucy Letby was wearing pyjamas when she was arrested. Johnson attempted to suggest that Lucy was lying when further investigation indicates that her comments were perfectly reasonable as she was wearing nightwear when she was arrested. 150. A third and particularly reprehensible example of this came when Johnson rather forcefully questioned Lucy Letby on a text message related to the phrase "going commando." This seemed to be a rather gratuitous and somewhat misogynistic aspect of his cross-examination. 151. Another farcical moment in the court case came when prosecutor Nick Johnson accused Lucy Letby of keeping a paper towel as a trophy. This was an extremely poorly founded allegation in the first place, but the prosecution also fabricated the suggestion that Lucy Letby fished the paper towel out of a confidential waste bin, even though this was without foundation. Many healthcare professionals have since suggested to me that this is essentially impossible. 152. The prosecution then alleged that Lucy had kept this paper towel as a trophy, even though it was found discarded in a Morrison's carrier bag underneath her bed and was clearly not treasured. Lucy's police interviews are completely consistent with this, and it's also doubtful that she could even have recovered the paper towel from a confidential waste bin, let alone without detection. This accusation was completely unsupported evidentially and is frankly utterly ludicrous. 153. Numerous assertions made by the prosecution are categorically untrue. All manner of hypothetical assertions related to Lucy Letby's whereabouts and various incidents on the unit were literally entirely fabricated by the prosecution without evidence, let alone proof. 154. Judge James Goss ruled that the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health report, which was highly critical of the Countess of Chester neonatal unit, should not be allowed in the court case as evidence. 155. Instructions from Judge James Goss enabled jurors to view Lucy Letby as guilty if they concluded that she acted with murderous intent. There was no requirement for the jury to be certain regarding the method of murder, lowering the requirements of reasonable doubt. 156. Similarly, Judge Goss allowed a majority verdict. It is known that majority verdicts are more readily associated with miscarriages of justice. 157. During the court case, the lead prosecution witness, Dr. Dewi Evans, overruled pathology reports filed by Dr. Jane Horden and a second raft of pathologist reports that examined the infants at the times of their death. Coroners also did this, and yet this was all struck out during the court case in favour of some often arcane theories from a retired paediatrician who now hasn't worked in a hospital for nearly 20 years. 158. Lucy's grievance procedure with the Countess of Chester Hospital was mentioned, but the court and jury were not informed that Dr. Stephen Breary, who gave evidence against Lucy Letby during the court case, was the instigator of action taken to remove Lucy from the neonatal unit. nor were the jury told the outcome of the grievance procedure, which was that all 7 points were upheld. Consultants on the unit were forced to apologise to Lucy for their conduct after an extensive independent investigation, but the court never heard of this. 159. The court did not hear about the campaign of Dr. Stephen Breary and Dr. Ravi Jairam, both of whom gave evidence in the court case to remove Lucy Letby from the unit. Nor did they hear that Dr. Stephen Breary located the insulin cases and that both Breary and Jairam had been involved in the selection of cases for the court case. 160. This is important because Dr. Stephen Breary located the insulin cases, which were central to the prosecution, and both Breary and Jairam had been involved in the selection of cases for the court case. This seems deeply inappropriate considering that both Dr. Jairam and primarily Dr. Stephen Breary literally ran a campaign to have Lucy Letby ejected from the neonatal unit. 161. There were 18 deaths associated with the neonatal unit over this period, and the vast majority of these infants died at the Countess Chester Hospital. The police investigated 17 of these 18 deaths, and the vast majority were excluded from the court case. This was never mentioned to the jury. 162. With this in mind, the jury never heard that 3 full-term infants born between 39 and 40-week gestation died during this period, which was already equal to Countess of Chester performance in previous years. This doesn't require any malignant behaviour from Lucy Letby, and when infants died at other hospitals are taken into consideration, already this exceeds the figures of previous years and creates a spike in itself. 163. The jury never heard about the tragic case of Noah Robinson, who had died at the Countess of Chester due to medical blunders from doctors who gave evidence during the court case. 164. The prosecution explicitly lied during its closing statement, claiming that the parents of Child E and Child F caught Lucy Letby red-handed. In reality, it was agreed evidence, and it is uncontested that no one has ever seen Lucy Letby do anything wrong. It is hard to characterise this as anything else other than a deliberate untruth from the prosecution. 165. An enormous amount of time was devoted to eyewitness accounts from parents and other relatives during the court case. However, these accounts essentially revealed nothing, as no one had seen Lucy Letby do anything wrong. It is clear that these were introduced in the court case purely in an attempt to emotionally sway the jury, which is both an underhand and inappropriate tactic, and also one that heightens the probability of a miscarriage of justice and unsafe conviction. 166. The court heard that Lucy Letby was removed from the neonatal unit, but it was indicated that this was due to suspicions among staff. Instead, it is now known thanks to the Thirlwell inquiry that Lucy Letby had been removed for her own protection. 167. Ian Harvey had informed pathologist Dr. Jane Horden in February 2017 that in citing the reduction in deaths after downgrading the unit, that the consultants were being selective and disingenuous in that there is no comparison between the intensity of the workload before and after we downgrade the unit, and we believe that they are trying to suggest that the only significant change has been reassigning the member of staff, which we did to protect that member. It should be noted that Dr. Breary would literally do exactly the same thing during the court case. 168. Throughout the court proceedings, the spike in deaths at the Countess of Chester was presented as an outlier. In fact, the Countess of Chester was one of 21 hospitals that were examined as part of the Mothers and Babies Reducing Risk Through Audits and Confidential Inquiries across the UK 2015 report, which is based on the widely adopted Embrace standards. This review found that although there had been an increase, many related to fetal abnormality or prematurity. There were no murder inquiries conducted at any of the other 20 hospitals that were reviewed at that time. 169. Infants from the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester died at other hospitals when Lucy Letby wasn't around, indicative of the problems the Countess of Chester unit was experiencing at that time. 170. Numerous collapses from indictment infants occurred in other hospitals. These were not included in the court case. 171. In another incident in court, Prosecutor Nick Johnson accused Letby of lying about being cut off and isolated from friends on the neonatal unit. Letby had described her colleagues as supportive, but that she had been told not to contact anyone on the unit. In response to this, Johnson accused her of telling a sob story, but a statement submitted to the Thirlwell inquiry in February 2025 by nurse Claire Bevan confirmed the account of Letby to be accurate. Bevan stated plainly that neonatal staff were told not to have any contact with Letby. 172. While Letby was expected to possess perfect recall of everything that has ever happened to her, those involved with the prosecution weren't quite so infallible. Dr. Dewi Evans made several mistakes of memory, perhaps not surprising for someone of his advancing years. Prosecuting barrister Nick Johnson was forced to concede that he'd accused Letby of lying in court, but was proved to be wrong, as he acknowledged himself. The memory of Dr. Jairam was, frankly, all over the place. Events were recalled incorrectly, other recollections were inserted into the court case that we now know to be incorrect. The prosecution reversed swipe card data, they failed to account for a staircase that renders this data worthless, there were cases and collapses being shifted around and in and out of the court case while relying on a shift chart that is categorically and fundamentally worthless. On reflection, it is fortunate that the prosecution didn't hold themselves to the same standard that they themselves required from Lucy Letby. Part 10. Anecdotal evidence problems. 173. Accusations and insinuations were also made with regard to handover sheets that were taken home by Lucy Letby inadvertently. The prosecution claimed that Lucy treasured these handover sheets as trophies related to her supposed murders, but in reality the vast majority of them were nothing to do with the court case. 174. Furthermore, handover sheets were found in bin bags in her garage, while one specific handover sheet was found in a keepsake box with a rose. This treasured handover sheet related to her first ever shift on the unit and was nothing to do with the court case. This wasn't an argument made by Lucy Letby or her defence. The rose and the keepsake box were raised by the prosecution in court. 175. The so-called confession note cited by the prosecution quite clearly isn't a confession note, not least because it contains many more statements indicating trauma and innocence than anything remotely approaching guilt. 176. The one statement that was used to indicate guilt includes the phrase "not good enough," clearly indicating that Lucy meant she was an inadequate nurse and that this had led to the deaths. Lucy indeed repeated this "not good enough" phrase both in a text message displayed in court and during police interviews. 177. It is also known that the so-called confession notes were written under the instruction of occupational health representative Catherine DeBager, encouraging Lucy to pour out her feelings. They were not an indicator of guilt, nor were they ever intended to be any form of confession. Catherine DeBager later wrote glowingly of Lucy in a document submitted to the Thirlwell inquiry. 178. Lucy's diary was cited as containing relevant information related to the supposed murders. Indeed, many people still wrongly believe that Lucy confessed in the diary. However, in reality, there is nothing of substance in this diary whatsoever. It consists of entirely mundane information. There was also supposed to be some sort of code that then runs throughout her messaging and other anecdotal materials collected by the police, but this was completely without foundation and frankly an utterly ludicrous suggestion. 179. Indeed, Cheshire Police never gave any details regarding this code, and the references that they have made to content in the diary have been confirmed by many nurses to be flatly incorrect. 180. Facebook searches made by Lucy Letby were also used in court as evidence, but these were essentially meaningless. 99% of them were nothing to do with the case. As an example, Lucy having searched for families on social media was presented by the prosecution as stalking behaviour. But she also did this in the case of child C, when it is now certain that she hadn't even encountered the child in question when the alleged evidence for murder was obtained. 181. Text messages recovered from Lucy's mobile phone contained no valid or useful information whatsoever. Even the police conceded that the content was remarkably normal. 182. There was no evidence recovered of Lucy having searched for any murder methods or anything related to murder. Indeed, as mentioned previously, there is no indication of any macabre interest in Lucy Letby. Quite the opposite, Lucy is about as squeaky clean as it's possible to be. 183. Lucy provided the police with extremely lengthy and indeed likely explanations for all anecdotal evidence, but in their wisdom, the Cheshire Constabulary completely ignored these explanations. 184. There is a blue post-it note which has received minimal publicity that contains several exculpatory statements. These include the fact that Lucy states that there is obviously no evidence against her at a time she never knew anyone would ever see these notes or that the police would arrest her. This is a clear statement of innocence from someone who believes herself to be innocent. Why does she believe herself to be innocent? Because she knows that she's innocent. Part 11. Retrial problems. 185. In the 2024 retrial of Child K, there was literally no meaningful evidence provided whatsoever. This conviction is entirely reliant on the eyewitness testimony of Dr. Ravi Jairam, which will be assessed imminently. 186. Judge James Goss informed the jury that they shouldn't make assumptions based on Letby's previous convictions and that they were to assess this case purely based on the evidence presented in court. But the prosecution was then allowed to reference the convictions continually throughout the court case without objection. 187. The jury for the retrial was expected to forget this, while also being repeatedly reminded of it, but were denied the right to read the New Yorker article by Rachel Aviv that is frequently referenced by people who have followed the case. Apparently, Aviv's work could have unfairly influenced the court proceedings. 188. Before going any further, analysis of the records related to the neonatal unit indicate that it is likely Dr. Jairam saw nurse Caroline Oakley near an incubator, not Lucy Letby. This would make sense considering shift patterns and what we know about movements on the unit. 189. During the retrial of Child K, the prosecution invented the new concept of catching someone virtually red-handed, a ridiculous notion which is literally physically impossible. You either catch someone red-handed or you don't catch them red-handed at all. You can't catch them virtually red-handed. This is simply nonsense. 190. The phrase standing over was used during the retrial and also at other points during the court case to give a sinister impression of the action of Lucy Letby. However, what Lucy was actually doing was observing infants, which is not only perfectly reasonable, but absolutely the correct thing for a neonatal nurse to do. 191. Indeed, Nick Johnson asserted during the retrial that we say in those circumstances the only reasonable thing for a nurse to do would be to call for help or use equipment to breathe for the child. The reason she was desaturating was because the breathing tube had become displaced, and we suggest that the fact Lucy Letby was doing nothing and the alarms weren't sounding was because it was Lucy Letby, the convicted murderer, who had displaced the tube. In fact, Lucy was following standard procedure for the neonatal unit, which had been disseminated to her during her training. Indeed, what else could she reasonably be expected to do? 192. It is also important to note that Child K was not Lucy's designated infant. She was, in fact, responding to an alarm in the only rational and professional way possible. 193. It hasn't been satisfactorily established that the breathing tube related to the Child K allegations was even dislodged at this time, never mind that it was dislodged deliberately, and certainly not the identity of the alleged person who had supposedly dislodged it. 194. Endotracheal tubes can become detached accidentally. There are, in fact, endless resources online regarding what to do in such an instance, and countless academic studies written about this. 195. Dr. Jairam had told Dr. Christopher Green during an interview that formed part of Letby's grievance procedure that there is no objective evidence at all to suggest that Lucy had harmed babies, and that the only concern raised about Lucy was she had been exposed to so many deaths, and this might be traumatic for her. Dr. Jairam also told Green on the 11th of November 2016 that the only concerns raised were that we had a statistically significant rise in unexplained deaths and near misses, and we didn't know why. While we know that Ravi doesn't exactly have the most sparkling memory, it does seem to have slipped his mind at this point that he's supposed to have seen Lucy attempting to murder a baby. He didn't mention it in any of the review meetings, any of the deep dive discussions. He didn't mention it when the Royal College came to do their investigation. He didn't say anything to the Care Quality Commission. He failed to mention any of this for well over a year, and then he finally managed to remember this when meeting with Nigel Wenham of Cheshire Police on the 15th of May 2017, some 453 days after it supposedly happened. 196. A new leaked email makes it clear that Dr. Jairam gave a different account previously to the one that he relied on in court. 197. With this in mind, Sir David Davis has written to Cheshire Police asking them to investigate Jairam for perjury. 198. And as one final nail in this particular coffin, what did Dr. Jairam tell the parents of Child A and Child B on the 10th of February 2016? Let's go through this nice and slowly. When monitors alarm, it is a signal to the staff to look at them. They often alarm due to movement or poor contact. If an alarm goes off, a member of staff may look up at the monitor, and if it is clear it is a false reading or just a minor change, then no action is necessarily needed. Usually, the first move would be to check the baby the monitor was attached to. For example, an oxygen monitor may read low, but if a baby is pink or if there is a poor trace on the monitor, then no action would be needed. This was disseminated by Dr. Jairam merely 7 days before he supposedly witnessed events related to Child K. 199. Lucy Letby was originally to have been charged with murder over Child K. It was only at the 11th hour during a hearing held at Manchester Crown Court on the 10th of June 2022 that the prosecution dropped its intention to accuse Letby of murdering Child K, an infant that died in another hospital 18 miles away from Chester, 3 days after Lucy had allegedly had contact with the baby, and even this wasn't satisfactorily established. 200. In summary, the conviction of Child K relies on an uncorroborated eyewitness account that is flawed evidence in the first place, emanating from someone who has changed his testimony at least 3 times and who quite evidently has a particularly unreliable memory, regarding an event about which the oxymoronically absurd suggestion was that he'd caught Letby virtually red-handed, about an incident for which there are far more plausible explanations, with no other supporting evidence whatsoever, for which it is doubtful that Lucy Letby was even in the room when the incident was supposedly observed, and about which Dr. Jairam had explicitly given a completely different and documented account previously. Please remember, Lucy Letby is serving a life sentence over this utter farce. In conclusion, I want viewers to remember that this video began by referencing some small disagreements regarding a few of the issues in reports submitted to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. There are 3 things to note about this. Firstly, the reports still stand firm. Secondly, all of the remainder of the reports weren't even challenged by Panorama. Thirdly, the Insulin report from Chase and Shannon clearly exonerates Lucy Letby, indicating that there is nothing unusual about the readings that triggered suspicions, and that those who were making them were simply ignorant of the facts. Finally, rest assured that I will be fully responding to the claims made by Moritz in Panorama and her lousy book in the days and weeks to come. Now, I want people to compare those tiny issues with the litany of gaping holes in the prosecution case. The prosecution case is plagued with abysmal science that credentialed scientists don't even take seriously, and lousy evidence that is either fundamentally flawed, specious, or both. The prosecution case is so full of holes that I would compare it to a colander, but then a colander still has actual substance. A colander is still a solid object. The prosecution case is so completely and utterly without foundation or credibility that it is positively vaporous. There were no murders on that unit. The prosecution case is junk. This case should never have gone to court. Judith Moritz and Panorama agree with that because they made absolutely no effort to buttress anything that was in the prosecution case. The sooner that we face up to this reality, the less embarrassing it's going to be for Britain as a country. But rest assured, this whole debacle is an enormous stain on this nation that will be indelibly written into British history and remembered for centuries to come. We must never forget the lessons that we learn from it. The bottom line is quite simple. The highly regarded neonatal nurse Lucy Letby is innocent. If you've enjoyed this video and have found the content valuable, please consider subscribing to the channel for much more content on this egregious miscarriage of justice. Thank you for watching.